History hides some of the most chilling stories ever lived, tales not of monsters, but of people. Behind grand plantations and southern charm were secrets darker than any nightmare. Tonight, we travel back to the heart of Alabama, where two sisters shared everything, even a man they claimed to own. But when both became pregnant, their twisted bond turned into something far more horrifying. The sun over Alabama was not gentle in those years. It bore down with a merciless molten glare, turning the soil into cracked veins of red clay, and the air into a thick, slow-moving haze that clung to skin like sweat-soaked cloth. The land stretched in every direction, cotton fields shimmering under heat. Old oak trees stooped like tired sentinels, their sprawling limbs draped in moss that hung low enough to brush the heads of those who passed beneath. Beneath that heavy sky, time itself seemed slower, older, as if the world had grown used to the weight of cruelty. Along the riverbanks, the plantations stood like proud, decaying monuments, their white columns gleaming by day and their windows glowing faintly by night. They were symbols of wealth built on torment, houses that looked alive only from a distance. Inside, the air was stale with the smell of wax, tobacco, and something faintly metallic that never quite left the floorboards. The laughter of owners, the crack of the overseer's whip, and the muffled cries of the enslaved were the rhythm of daily life. It was a soundscape that belonged to both the living and the haunted. The year was somewhere in the early half of the 19th century, when Alabama's fields were rich and the markets richer. Cotton was king, and behind every bale stood the broken hands of those who worked the rows from the first light of dawn until the moon climbed high enough to catch their sweat in its silver glow. The world beyond the plantation gates, the towns, the churches, the dances, seemed to exist in another dimension entirely, one that fed off the suffering buried in the soil. The wealth of the South was written not in ink, but in blood, and every plantation was its own small kingdom of silence and fear. The nights carried their own kind of terror. The air did not cool so much as thicken. The stillness could press against the chest until breathing felt like a sin. Cicadas filled the dark with their high, feverish hum, and somewhere beyond the fields, wolves or dogs, depending on who you asked, howled as if calling for lost souls. Lanterns flickered in the windows of the big houses, their glow trembling through lace curtains. Beneath those same windows, the cabins of the enslaved glimmered faintly with dying embers, where whispers carried stories of spirits, vengeance, and freedom. In Alabama's heartland, nature and cruelty had formed a strange harmony. The trees themselves seemed to remember what had been done beneath their branches. The river's current moved slow and secretive, as if unwilling to carry away the things it had seen. The ground was a mosaic of ash, sweat, and memory. Storms would roll through without warning, tearing through the fields, splitting trees, and washing away the traces of blood that the overseers left behind. But when the skies cleared and the sun returned, the cotton would stand tall again, white and soft as if untouched by sin. Plantations were living organisms. Every brick, every nail, every window pane carried the pulse of those who built them. The grand mansions rose above the land like altars, their steps worn smooth by years of ritual, morning prayers, afternoon inspections, evening feasts. The air inside was thick with vanity, polished silver on long tables, portraits of stern-faced ancestors, the perfume of magnolia blossoms arranged to hide the smell of decay. Yet beneath the surface, something rotten always lingered. The walls absorbed secrets. The mirrors held reflections that didn't always move with those who passed. The very wood creaked not from age but from memory. The social order was a kind of slow poison. White families dined in grandeur, while men and women in chains stood nearby, silent and watchful, their humanity buried beneath rules written to erase it. Children grew up learning that power was their birthright, that cruelty was discipline, that the screams from the fields were no different than the wind in the trees. The enslaved lived in a different world entirely, a world of exhaustion, endurance, and whispered prayers. Their hands worked the fields, their bodies bore the scars, their songs carried both sorrow and strength. There were places on the edge of the plantation that even the overseers avoided. The swamp lands, where mist rose from the earth in the early hours, were said to be cursed. Those who tried to run were rumored to vanish there, swallowed by the water or by something worse. The old people spoke of spirits born from injustice, of figures that moved between trees when the moon was high, of cries that echoed long after a life had been taken. Some nights, even the most callous of men claimed to hear those sounds and found themselves unable to sleep. By day, the plantation looked alive. The rows were straight, the cotton bright, the workers lined in symmetry like clockwork. But beneath that order was an invisible chaos. Hunger gnawed, grief festered, and rage simmered behind eyes forced to look downward. The sisters who owned one such estate, young, identical, beautiful, walked through this world like queens. They had inherited their wealth and their cruelty in equal measure. Around them, everything seemed still, as if the land itself held its breath when they passed. They had grown up knowing nothing but command, and in their shadow, fear became as common as dust. The sky in that part of Alabama could change in moments. A clear morning could turn into a storm by afternoon, the wind sweeping through the fields like a warning. Thunder would roll low across the hills, shaking the shutters of the mansion. The enslaved would hurry to bring in the wash, to tie down the loose wood, to keep the fire from dying in the hearth. The sisters would stand at the tall windows, watching the sky bruise black, their reflections merging in the glass until even they could not tell themselves apart. Beyond the house, the fields stretched endlessly. During harvest, the cotton looked like snow, but it was heavy with misery. Every handful plucked came with pricked fingers, raw knuckles, sunburnt necks. Overseers rode horses between the rows, shouting commands, measuring time not by the clock, but by how much flesh they could wring into profit. The sound of the whip cracked across the open air and echoed through the hills, carried by the wind until it faded into the endless drone of insects. There were towns nearby, small places with wooden storefronts, dusty roads, and churches that preached righteousness by day while turning blind eyes by night. The people there lived comfortably, their lives built on the quiet acceptance of horror. To them, the plantations were signs of success, proof that God had chosen some to rule and others to serve. But even in those towns, there were whispers, stories carried by travelers, by peddlers, by those who had seen too much. They spoke of strange happenings in certain houses, of shadows moving where none should, of cries that did not belong to the living. The Alabama heat was relentless. It warped the air, it slowed time, it made tempers short and passions sharp. It was in this heat that sins festered, that desires twisted into cruelty. Nights brought little relief, just darkness, and the illusion of peace. The cicada's song filled the air. The trees swayed as if restless, and in the distance the faint glow of lanterns marked where the living still toiled. Somewhere behind the high walls and heavy curtains, two sisters slept under linen sheets, their dreams colored by the same darkness that stained the land around them. Theirs was a world built on silence and control, and beneath that silence, something old and waiting stirred in the red soil of Alabama. They were born minutes apart. Two cries rising in the same dim room, echoing through the halls of a house that already smelled of wealth and fear. The midwife, a woman whose hands trembled from exhaustion and dread, would later say that when the twins first looked at each other, they did not blink. Even as infants, they seemed to share a single pulse, a single will, as if nature itself had made a mistake by dividing one soul into two fragile bodies. As they grew, the resemblance deepened until it became unnerving. Same pale skin untouched by the sun, same dark curls that refused to stay pinned, same wide grey eyes that could appear innocent one moment and hollow the next. To those who worked the estate, they were indistinguishable. Two faces in identical silk dresses, gliding through corridors like reflections caught between mirrors. Their mother died before they were old enough to remember her. Their father, a man hardened by profit and pride, raised them in the image of power. In that grand house, they learned early that love was a transaction. The affection they received came not through tenderness, but through possession. Servants bowed, tutors obeyed, and their father's word was final. The sisters absorbed this lesson with the quiet precision of children who understood that affection must be earned by control. They watched the way their father ruled, how he spoke of crops, of bodies, of value, and they began to imitate his tone, his gaze, his cruel calm. By the time they reached adolescence, their connection had become the subject of whispered talk. They moved in perfect rhythm, one speaking, the other smiling, one turning, the other following as though tugged by an invisible thread. They dressed alike not from vanity, but from compulsion. To separate them seemed almost sacrilegious. Even their tutors could not tell where one ended and the other began. When punished, they endured in silence, each seeming to feel the sting of the other's pain. Their father found this bond amusing at first, a curiosity to display before guests. But as the years passed, it unsettled even him. There was something too absolute about it, something that defied ordinary affection. The sisters, however, found comfort only in each other. They shared everything, food, secrets, dreams. Their rooms mirrored one another, down to the placement of brushes and ribbons. They whispered through the night about the world beyond the plantation, of towns they had never seen, of people who lived without servants, of streets where one could walk unseen. Yet beneath those murmured fantasies, another feeling simmered, a hunger for control. They had been taught that dominance was the measure of worth, and already they practiced it in small ways. A lingering command, a cruel game with the kitchen staff, a test of obedience disguised as play. When their father died suddenly one summer, the estate passed to them. Neighbors offered condolences and warnings, suggesting that two young women could not manage so vast a property alone. The sisters smiled politely, but their eyes gleamed with defiance. They were determined not to be pitied. They would run the plantation as he had, perhaps better. From that day forward, the house took on a different silence, heavier, watchful. The twins walked through its halls like twin queens crowned in mourning. Those who served them noticed changes. The laughter that once floated through the rooms vanished. Curtains stayed drawn even in daylight. The sisters no longer hosted guests or attended services in town. They seemed content to live within the walls that had raised them, tending to the ledgers, inspecting the fields, issuing commands in voices that were identical in pitch and coldness. The overseer, an older man with a nervous twitch, swore he sometimes saw one sister near the stables, while the other stood on the porch at the same time. It was as if the house itself played tricks on the eyes. Their bond deepened into something suffocating. When one fell ill, the other mirrored her fever. When one wept, the other's eyes reddened. They finished each other's gestures as naturally as breathing. It was no longer companionship, but a kind of possession. And in that possession, jealousy began to bloom, not toward outsiders, but toward each other. Each wanted to be the truer half, the dominant spirit. The rivalry was subtle at first, expressed in lingering glances or the tightening of a jaw. Yet beneath those quiet moments lay the beginnings of something darker. The plantation became their kingdom of control. They ruled with precision, recording every hour of labor, every bushel picked, every infraction punished. Yet the sameness of their lives gnawed at them. The days blended into one another until even they could no longer recall which memories belonged to whom. Visitors spoke of how strange it was to see them together, two beautiful women with identical expressions, standing so close their shadows merged. There was charm in their symmetry, but also unease. On rare evenings, they would walk to the edge of the fields, their white dresses brushing the cotton like ghosts passing through. The workers watched from a distance, unsure whether to fear them or pity them. The twins spoke little, their silence broken only by the rustle of skirts and the faraway cry of a whip. Sometimes they lingered by the river, staring at their reflection, until the surface rippled and split their mirrored faces apart. In those moments, each would feel an inexplicable hatred for the image staring back, familiar yet foreign, beloved yet unbearable. The house itself began to reflect their tension. Doors creaked open without touch. Candles burned unevenly, mirrors clouded at dawn. Servants whispered that the sisters were cursed, that their likeness had drawn envy from forces older than time. They laughed at such superstition, but even they felt the unease. The more they tried to control their surroundings, the more the world around them seemed to resist, yet their closeness persisted, bound by habit and fear. They slept in adjoining rooms, sometimes in the same bed, when storms rolled across the hills. They could not be apart for long. Distance made them anxious, restless. Their hearts beat in unison, their footsteps matched even when unplanned. They were halves of a single being struggling for dominance. Each wanted to be whole, but wholeness for them meant erasing the other. In the nearby town, stories spread like smoke. People said the sisters had eyes that could freeze blood, that their laughter echoed through the woods long after they were gone. Some swore that when you looked into their faces, you could see the faint shimmer of something unnatural, an energy too perfect, too symmetrical. But no one dared speak of it near the plantation. The twins ruled that land as their father once had, their beauty a mask, their gentleness a performance. Beneath the surface, they were creatures of calculation, bound by vanity and mirrored guilt. Season after season, they drifted deeper into isolation. Their bond, once comforting, became a cage. Each morning they rose together, each night they retired under the same roof, but inside them something restless stirred. They had learned to mimic humanity without ever feeling its warmth. They were admired, feared, and utterly alone within their reflection of each other. As the red earth outside the windows waited silently for the next chapter of their inheritance to unfold. He was brought to the estate on a late summer morning, when the heat lay low over the fields and the sky glared white like polished bone. The wagon that carried him came up the long dirt road, its wheels crunching through dust and gravel, the sound carrying across the quiet land. By the time it stopped in front of the mansion, the cicadas had gone still, and the air itself seemed to pause. The overseer climbed down first, followed by the man whose life had already been written by others before he could claim it as his own. He was young, but carried the exhaustion of someone twice his age. His hands were thick with callus, his shoulders marked with the faded scars of a laborer's life. His eyes, dark and watchful, did not rise to meet those who inspected him, but there was something in the way he stood, still yet unbroken, that unsettled those who saw him. The overseer muttered something about his strength, his endurance, his price. But the twins, standing on the porch in pale dresses that glowed in the sunlight, were silent. Their eyes moved over him as if measuring not a man but a presence, something to be studied, something that would disturb the stillness of their world. He was assigned work among the stables at first, tending horses and cleaning tools, his days marked by the rhythm of chores that never ended. Yet the twins noticed him often. They passed by the stables more than they ever had before, lingering beneath the shade of the oak trees, their parasols turning lazily in the heat. The older of the two watched him with curiosity, the younger with something colder, though it was hard to tell where one's fascination ended and the other's began. Their voices, nearly identical, carried across the yard like echoes of the same thought. The workers learned to avert their eyes when the sisters drew near, for nothing good ever came from being the focus of their attention. As the days passed, the young man became part of the landscape, the quiet rhythm of his work blending into the hum of the plantation. But the sisters' gaze followed him. They noticed his silence, how he moved with the steady patience of someone who had long since learned that survival depended on restraint. They spoke of him to one another in low tones, not out of compassion, but from the thrill of discovery. He was something they could observe, dissect, control. They were creatures of power, accustomed to command, and in him they found a mirror that did not reflect their authority back at them. The house servants whispered of strange changes in the sisters' routine. They took walks near the stables at dusk, when the light was low and the air heavy with the scent of hay and horse sweat. They found reasons to call for him, tasks that could have been handled by others. A lantern would burn late in the window overlooking the courtyard, and shadows would move behind the curtains. The mansion, once a place of rigid order, seemed to shift around this new, quiet tension. Even the air inside the halls felt thicker, charged with something unseen. The young man's life narrowed to the rhythm of command. He ate little, slept less, and worked under the watch of eyes that never seemed to blink. But there was something different in this attention, something quieter, more dangerous. It was not the rage of a whip or the threat of punishment. It was curiosity, fascination, possession. The twins, so alike in every gesture, began to compete in ways no one spoke. There came a time when the tension between the sisters could no longer hide beneath the calm surface of their routines. The air inside the mansion was dense with it, heavy enough that even the servants moved quieter, afraid of disturbing whatever fragile peace remained. The sisters had grown restless, their every glance toward each other lined with something sharper than affection. They spoke little now, their gestures more like rehearsed performances than natural movement. Each day they circled the same subject without words, the man who worked below their window, the one whose presence neither could ignore. In the beginning, their curiosity had been harmless, a distraction from the monotony of isolation. But fascination, once awakened, does not sleep easily. It had spread between them like a fever, slow and invisible, until their bond, so unbreakable, so mirrored, began to warp under the strain. The twins had shared everything since birth, rooms, clothes, secrets, thoughts. But to share desire was different. It was not born of love, but of dominance, the need to prove control, to own what no one else could touch. The man had become the quiet center of their world. His silence drew them, his restraint intrigued them. They mistook his endurance for defiance, and defiance was something neither had ever tolerated. Yet when they tried to break him with their will, he remained still, calm and unyielding. It was this stillness that consumed them. They began to confuse power with fascination, cruelty with closeness. Each wanted to possess the feeling of command he awakened in them, to be the one who could bend that calm into submission. But in their struggle for dominance, they mirrored each other more than ever. The idea of a pact was born not out of reason, but out of pride. It came to them in the stillness of an oppressive summer afternoon, when the air shimmered with heat and the cicadas cried like something dying. They decided that they would share him, not from compassion or fairness, but from the belief that this act would prove their control absolute. In their minds, such a decision was not degradation, but mastery, not sin, but symmetry. To them, there was no cruelty in their arrangement, only the confirmation of their power. After that day, the mansion's silence changed. The servants sensed it first. The uneasy rhythm of footsteps in the halls, the soft closing of doors at hours when sleep should have ruled. The twins moved with a new intensity, their eyes brighter, their tempers more volatile. They spent less time together and more time apart, though their lives still mirrored in eerie ways. One would vanish into the lower corridors, and the other would follow hours later. Meals went untouched, mirrors went uncovered, and the air inside the house began to thrum with something that had no name. The pact did not bring peace. Instead, it deepened the fracture between them. Each believed herself stronger, more deserving, more capable of control. They began to study one another as they once studied him, looking for weakness, for signs of surrender. The very closeness that had once defined them now suffocated. They dressed differently for the first time, small variations that felt like declarations of war. Servants avoided their eyes, unsure which sister they faced at any given moment. For both now carried a look that seemed half mad with obsession. The man endured it all in silence, trapped within a power he did not seek. The pact had made him less human in their eyes, reduced him to a living symbol of their own struggle. He existed between them like a shadow that neither could step out of. To resist was dangerous. To obey was to surrender his last fragments of self. Around him, the walls of the mansion seemed to close in tighter each day, the air thick with perfume and despair. Even the light that filtered through the tall windows felt dimmer, as if the house itself recoiled from what it sheltered. Outside, the plantation continued its brutal rhythm. The fields shimmered white with cotton, the overseers' voices carried across the air, and life went on under the same heavy sun. But within the mansion, time had begun to twist. The sisters' days no longer followed the natural order of dawn and dusk. They woke late, wandered the halls like sleepwalkers, and stared for long hours out of windows, as if expecting the landscape itself to change. They were becoming creatures of confinement, feeding on the very tension they had created. The pact, meant to preserve their bond, had instead unmade it. Their mirrored lives cracked along invisible lines. The older began to act with feverish energy, giving orders with a voice that trembled between rage and fear. The younger withdrew into silence, her eyes glassy and distant, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. They avoided mirrors now. Reflection had become unbearable. The sight of themselves, so identical, so inescapably linked, was a reminder of everything they could not control. Rumors spread beyond the estate. The people in town spoke of the sisters' madness, of strange sounds from the mansion at night, of candlelight flickering long past midnight. Some claimed to have seen figures moving behind the upstairs curtains, pacing, circling, whispering. The overseer began drinking heavily, muttering that the land itself was cursed, that the air had grown foul. Even the workers in the fields said the earth felt colder beneath their feet, that the crops no longer grew right. The plantation, once alive with cruel order, was beginning to decay from within. The sisters themselves no longer seemed entirely of this world. Their beauty took on an unnatural edge. Cheeks too pale, eyes too bright, movements too precise. They had once been mirrors of one another, but now their reflection was fractured. Where one's voice softened, the other's sharpened. Where one wept, the other smiled faintly, as though savoring the sight of her twins unraveling. The pact had bound them tighter than ever, but it had also cursed them to compete for something neither could truly possess. The man who had become the object of their pact carried on in silence, his existence reduced to the quiet endurance of two forces tearing each other apart. He saw the madness building in their faces, the flicker of something unnatural in their eyes, and knew that whatever had begun as cruelty was now turning into something far worse. He could feel it in the stillness of the nights, in the way the air seemed to hum before dawn, in the way the mansion creaked as though it too could sense the corruption spreading through its walls. What began as control had turned into obsession. What started as a pact of power had become a descent into something neither sister understood. A hunger that no act could satisfy, a mirror that reflected not beauty or dominance, but the slow, inevitable collapse of two souls, devouring each other in the silence of their own creation. The months turned thick and heavy with the weight of heat and silence. The air in Alabama had grown still, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, when even the cicadas quiet and the sky seems to wait. The mansion that once stood bright against the horizon had dulled, its paint fading under relentless sun, its windows dim with dust. Inside, the sisters drifted through their routines like restless spirits, bound by the pact that had long since begun to poison them. Their faces, once identical in every shade and gesture, began to change. The first signs were small. An unsteady hand, a faint pallor, a sleeplessness that no tonic could ease. Servants noticed before the sisters themselves would speak of it. The younger complained of dizziness, the elder of exhaustion. Meals were sent away untouched. Dresses no longer fit as they once had. The whispers began in the kitchen and the fields before they reached the halls of the mansion. The whispers said that both sisters carried the same burden. No one dared to name it aloud, but the truth moved like a shadow through the house. The twins, so bound by pride, did not confront it at first. They carried on as if nothing had changed, their movements slower but still deliberate, their eyes hollow but defiant. Yet the silence between them deepened until it felt like a living thing. Every glance was an accusation. Every shared space trembled with the weight of what neither could deny. They had made a pact of control, and now the consequence of that pact had taken root in their very bodies. The plantation itself seemed to sicken with them. The crops wilted in patches, the river receded, and the horses grew skittish in their stalls. Storms gathered more often, rolling low across the fields and breaking open the sky with thunder that shook the glass. The servants worked in fearful silence, glancing toward the mansion where curtains stayed drawn and windows fogged with heat. Nights filled with uneasy sounds, footsteps pacing, floorboards creaking, the faint sob of something half-human and half-ghostly echoing through the corridors. Within the house, time lost its measure. The sisters avoided mirrors now, their reflections unbearable. Their resemblance, once a source of pride, became torment. One could not look at the other without seeing her own guilt. The younger grew quiet, withdrawn into rooms that smelled of lavender and stale air, her hands trembling when they rested on her stomach. The elder grew angry, prowling the halls like a trapped thing, her temper sharp enough to draw blood from anyone unlucky enough to cross her path. They no longer walked together. Their paths wound separately through the house, each listening for the other's footsteps, each haunted by the echo. The knowledge of their condition did not remain secret for long. Word slipped beyond the gates, carried by servants who feared divine punishment more than their mistress's wrath. The townsfolk began to talk. Some whispered that the twins had been cursed for their... The years moved on, though time itself seemed unwilling to touch the place. The plantation stood like a wound that refused to close, its walls sagging under the memory of what had happened. The once grand estate was now avoided even by the wind. Grass grew wild around the gates, the road leading to it swallowed by creeping weeds, and the air hung heavy with the scent of decay. The locals no longer called it by name. They referred to it only as the twins' place, spoken in hushed tones that carried both pity and dread. Children were warned not to wander near its borders after dusk, and even the bravest riders quickened their pace when passing by, afraid to look too long at the windows where flickering lights were sometimes seen. Within those rotting walls, remnants of the sisters' presence lingered like a stain. The portraits that once hung in gilded frames had been covered with white cloths, yet the outlines of two identical faces could still be seen beneath the fabric, faint and ghostly in the dim light. The mirrors, long since cracked, reflected not images but shadows that moved of their own accord. The scent of old perfume still clung to the upper rooms, mingled with the sharp odor of mold and the faint metallic tang of rusted fixtures. In some corners, faint traces of footprints appeared on dusty floors and then disappeared again, as though someone still wandered there in restless silence. Stories grew from what remained. They said the sisters never left, that death itself refused to take them. Some claimed their spirits lingered out of love for the land, others that they were bound by guilt too deep to release. People spoke of lullabies drifting across the fields at night, soft and distant, the same haunting tune that had once soothed two children who vanished before they could be named. No graves were ever marked for them, no records kept of their births or deaths. Only silence, heavy and eternal, filled the halls where their cries had once echoed. The legend spread far beyond the county, carried by traders, travelers, and those who sought dark stories to tell by firelight. It was said that on certain nights when the moon hung low and red over the fields, twin figures could be seen standing at the upper window of the old house, their faces pale and identical, their eyes fixed on the horizon as if waiting for something that would never return. Some claimed that if one stared too long, the figures would turn in unison and vanish, leaving behind the faint sound of a child crying. For those who worked the nearby fields in later years, the land itself seemed haunted. Crops refused to grow properly near the mansion, and animals would not graze too close to the fence line. Farmers spoke of sudden chills sweeping through the fields, even on the hottest days. Once a group of laborers clearing brush near the old well reported hearing footsteps circling them, though no one was there. When they returned the next morning, the ground bore prints that led nowhere, vading into the soil like breath into fog. As decades passed, the story took on new shapes, told and retold, until it blurred the line between truth and superstition. Some said the sisters' children had lived, hidden away by fearful servants, and that their descendants wandered the south under false names, marked by eyes that never quite matched. Others whispered that the twins had been buried together beneath the house itself, sealed away by a family desperate to hide its shame. A few even claimed that the house would not allow anyone to live there again, that those who tried heard voices in the walls and woke to find their dreams filled with two identical faces watching from the dark. The state eventually claimed the land, but no one wanted it. Surveyors who came to map the property complained of broken compasses and faint whispers that seemed to follow them from room to room. Their reports were left unfinished, their maps incomplete. The papers yellowed with time and disappeared into government archives, filed under properties of uncertain ownership. The plantation faded from legal memory, but not from the mouths of those who lived nearby. Even now, when the night grows too still, the old road to the estate seems to remember. The trees that line it twist in strange directions, their branches arching toward the center as though reaching for each other. Travelers who have dared to walk it after sunset speak of hearing soft laughter, the kind that carries both sweetness and cruelty. They say the air turns colder with every step closer to the mansion, and by the time its silhouette emerges, the world feels hollow, stripped of sound, except for the rustle of unseen movement. Inside what remains of the house, nature has begun to reclaim its dominion. Vines crawl up the staircases, ivy threads through the window frames, and the floors groan beneath the weight of years. Yet beneath the decay, something still breathes. Locals say candles appear in the windows without flame, faint glows that move from room to room as though guided by invisible hands. The walls, blackened with age, carry faint marks that look like fingerprints, smeared in patterns too deliberate to be chance. Some nights, distant from the road, the faint cry of an infant can still be heard, though no one has lived there for more than a century. Historians have tried to trace the truth. They dig through records, searching for mention of the sisters, of their family, of the man whose life became their curse. But time has erased names, burned ledgers, and swallowed evidence. Only fragments remain, a torn letter, a birth entry with the ink faded to near nothing, a record of property transferred and then abandoned. The story, however, refuses to die. It lingers like smoke, finding its way into every generation that tries to forget. Those who visit the ruins now do so quietly, their footsteps careful, their voices low. They say the place feels alive, as if it listens. Some claim to feel watched from the upper windows, though nothing moves within. Others leave offerings, flowers, candles, tokens of protection, hoping to appease whatever still lingers. Yet no offering seems to change the air there. The land hums with a quiet sorrow, a memory of something that never found peace. The legend of the twin sisters has become a tale told to children as warning and to adults as fascination. It reminds listeners of the weight of cruelty, of the way power twists into madness, of the way sin can sink into the soil and never let go. The plantation remains where it has always been, hidden behind tangled brush and memories too painful to name. Some say the sisters walk there still, forever bound by the pact that began their ruin, whispering to each other in the same mirrored tones that once charmed and destroyed everything in their path. After the twins' deaths, the house did not fall silent. It exhaled, as if drawing breath for the first time in years, and then began to whisper. The few servants who remained claimed the air grew colder at dusk, heavy with something unseen yet present. The mansion seemed to breathe with the rhythm of old wood and sorrow. The floorboards creaked as though under unseen footsteps, doors opened without wind, and the faint sound of fabric brushing against the walls drifted through the corridors. The scent of lavender lingered in rooms long empty, mixed with the faint, unmistakable trace of iron that no cleaning could erase. Those who stayed on the land spoke of how the nights became longer. Time itself seemed to stretch inside the house. The great clock in the hallway stopped keeping time, its hands frozen at the same hour, though no one could remember when it had last been wound. The mirrors, already cracked, reflected movement when none was there. Some swore they saw twin shapes moving through the glass, flickering like candlelight before fading into shadow. The house, once proud, had become something half alive, its silence no longer peace but waiting. The servants left one by one. Some left in daylight, refusing to return for their pay. Others fled before dawn, too frightened to speak of what they had seen. A few stayed out of loyalty or desperation, but even they would not go near the upper floors. The nursery door, nailed shut after the sisters' deaths, began to rattle at night, as if something small and restless moved behind it. Once when a storm broke over the fields, a worker claimed to hear the sound of children crying from inside, soft at first, then rising until it drowned the thunder. When the morning came, the door stood open though the nails remained untouched. In time, no one lived there. The plantation fell quiet, except for the wind, which carried strange sounds through the halls. Travelers who sought shelter on rainy nights often left before dawn, pale and trembling. They spoke of hearing footsteps following them up the stairs, of laughter echoing down the corridors, light and childlike, then twisting into something hollow and low. One man claimed to have seen two identical figures at the end of the hall, their faces hidden in shadow, their dresses white with age, standing so still that he thought them statues until one turned her head. The townsfolk came to fear the sight of the mansion against the horizon. In daylight it was only a ruin, grey and sagging, half swallowed by vines. But at night it glowed faintly from within, as though lit by invisible hands. Some said candles burned in the windows, others that the light came from no fire, but from the very walls, pulsing like a heartbeat. The church tried once to bless the land, sending a preacher and his assistants to pray in every room. They returned by sunrise, pale and wordless, and the preacher never spoke of what he had found. The locals began to tell stories to explain what lingered there. They said the sisters had never left because they could not. Their hatred and sorrow had sunk too deep into the walls. Some believed they searched for the sleepless nights and unease. Others left abruptly, unwilling to describe what had disturbed them. A few were found wandering the woods at dawn, confused and trembling, their minds fractured by something they could not name. They spoke of seeing the sisters standing among the ruins, faces hidden, their movements synchronized, as if caught in the rhythm of some ancient ritual. Local churches tried to sanctify the ground. Priests blessed the soil, crosses were planted near the entrance, and prayers were spoken in voices thick with fear. But the earth rejected the gesture. The crosses fell within days, and the carved wood rotted faster than nature should allow. The locals stopped trying to purify the place. They came to accept it as it was, a reminder of something the living could not fix, a symbol of how cruelty and grief could outlast their makers, growing roots that reached far deeper than any grave. With each generation, the legend evolved. It began to appear in books about southern folklore, in collections of ghost stories, in whispered retellings on porches during long, humid nights. Writers and poets reimagined the twins as tragic figures, victims of circumstance, women destroyed by love and power. But the oldest voices, the ones who still lived near the land, refused to romanticize it. They said the sisters were neither victims nor villains, but reflections of what lies dormant in all people when power meets desire without restraint. They said the haunting was not punishment but memory, repeating itself endlessly because the world had never truly changed. The plantation became a warning, a quiet echo of a time that still bled into the present. People spoke of how history never really died, how the sins of those before still breathed in the corners of the earth, shaping everything that followed. The sisters' story became a mirror for those who told it, each generation seeing in it something of their own guilt, their own fear, their own fascination with power and possession. And though the house itself had nearly vanished, the idea of it remained, pulsing beneath the soil like a buried heart that refused to stop beating. When storms rolled over the fields, thunder shaking the ground, the wind carried faint traces of their presence. Some claimed to hear laughter woven into the